Hi guys, today I said we're gonna do a therapy video, and this is about a really important topic. It's called co-narcissism and how we accommodate to narcissistic parents. Okay, so this is based off of an article by Alan Rappoport. Okay, I really like this paper. It was recommended by a friend of mine a couple of years ago. I read it and it really resonated with me. And now reading it again, it resonates with me in a lot of other ways. Okay, so I'm gonna start by first of all defining what a narcissist is. So according to this paper, a narcissist is defined as people with very low self-esteem who attempt to control others' views of them for defensive purposes. They are interpersonally rigid, easily offended, self-absorbed, blaming, and find it difficult to empathize with others. So just like the spouses of alcoholics develop codependency, the children or the spouses of narcissists develop co-narcissism, okay? So it defines co-narcissists, i.e. the people who are like in some sort of a relationship with narcissists, as people who work hard to please others, defer to others' opinions, i.e. like they always seek out other people's opinions. They worry about how others think and feel about them. They're often depressed or anxious. They find it hard to know their own views and experiences, and they take blame for interpersonal problems usually. And they fear being considered selfish if they act assertively. So I feel like most people I know fall into the co-narcissist category. I myself identify very strongly as a co-narcissist. The example that they give in this paper is that the narcissist is always on stage and they always need an audience, and the co-narcissist is the one that's tending to them, that's giving them all of the emotions and all of the validation that they need at all times just to feel like good about themselves. And obviously, as a comedian, as a stage performer, you can only guess what I felt reading that. All right, so narcissism in general is described as a psychological state rooted in extremely low self-esteem. Narcissistic people are very fearful of not being well regarded by others. Okay, so it stems from a lot of insecurity, and they're really afraid that other people are not going to regard them highly. So they therefore attempt to control the behaviors of other people to sort of like manipulate and prove to themselves that they are regarded very highly, to protect their own self-esteem, which is already very low, right? So the underlying psychological mechanism that's taking place with narcissists is that they just feel a sense of dangerous inadequacy, and they're very vulnerable to blame and rejection, which is why like they always like blame others. And sometimes like to try and protect themselves from these narcissistic thoughts, they become like so preoccupied and concerned with their social image. They develop like a sense of grandiosity, and they also then can get really immersed with their own affairs, and they find it hard to like include other people, and then they also just can't really empathize with other people. Like they just kind of make it like all about them. But they make it all about them not from, you know, like a very empowered place. Like it actually comes from a very insecure place, a place where they're so afraid that other people are not going to regard them highly, and they derive all of their worth from external sources. So that's kind of why they become so preoccupied with themselves and trying to almost like prove to other people that they are amazing and worth being respected. So this paper talks about how a high proportion of people who go to therapy have dealt with and suffered from a relationship with a narcissist at some point in their lives. Usually it's from a parent, can also be a spouse. And as a result of that, these co-narcissists have not been able to develop healthy means of self-expression and self-directedness. Because it's like the other person is taking up so much space that you are always like catering to them, you're always tending to them, so you almost like don't even have any time or luxury to like discover your own voice or who you are, because your whole life is about managing the narcissist. So if you have a narcissistic parent, the extent to which the parent is narcissistic basically manifests by them controlling, blaming, becoming very self-absorbed, intolerant of others' views, unaware of their children's needs, and the effects that their behavior is having on their children. And they require the children to see them as the parents they wish to be seen. and they kind of like yell at them if they don't see them in that way. And then a lot of times narcissists actually see their children as extension of themselves. So they then project everything that they believe they want to be in society. They project that onto their children, which, you know, a tale as old as time is like when parents, if like a dad is a lawyer and he wants his child to be a lawyer because he's like an extension of him, so he like pushes him to succeed academically because that's how he derives his own worth. So the children of narcissists themselves tend to feel overly responsible for people. They tend to be unaware of their own feelings and their needs and experiences, and they kind of like fade into the background of relationships. This is mostly true for romantic relationships, can also be true for friendships and just in general. Co-narcissists are typically insecure because they themselves have not been valued for who they are. They've only been valued by their parent to the extent in which they fulfill their parents' needs. So it's like a very selfish kind of a love. And they develop their self-concepts based on their parents' treatment of them. And therefore, they often have highly inaccurate ideas of themselves and of their worth. And they may fear that they are inherently insensitive, selfish, defective, fearful, unloving, overly demanding, hard to satisfy, inhibited, worthless. Guys, this was literally me like going into therapy. Like I felt all of those things. Like I was like, I feel worthless. Like I don't know who I am. I don't know what my views are. I don't know what my opinions are. Everything is my fault. So it's pretty powerful to just know that this is actually like a concept, and it's like a dynamic. I feel a little bit more empowered in knowing that, because then you know that it's not about you and it's more about the environment that you were in. So usually when you are a co-narcissist, you tend to believe that there are only two roles in a relationship. Like there's only a narcissist and a co-narcissist. Because that's the only thing you've ever seen, like you just always kind of assume that another person is going to be a narcissist. The crazy thing about both of these conditions or these titles is that they're both actually rooted in very low self-esteem, and both are ways of defending oneself from fears resulting in internalized criticisms from other people. So it's like the narcissist has extremely low self-esteem, which is why they try and control others' views of them, and the co-narcissist has extremely low self-esteem because of what the narcissist has done to them. So it's pretty wild. This paper also goes on to talk about what happens when a co-narcissist or a narcissist go to therapy. So interestingly enough, the paper basically says that like therapy doesn't really work on narcissists, because narcissists are deathly afraid of like basically being discovered for the flawed person that they are. They just very much like never find themselves in therapy. They never really go. And if they are in therapy, they'll just kind of like ridicule the whole therapy experience. They'll kind of like belittle and ridicule the therapist themselves. They won't think like it's beneficial or anything like that. They won't really like surrender to the therapy process. Whereas co-narcissists are probably what therapy mostly consists of, are just co-narcissist clients, because co-narcissists already feel like they are the ones to blame for all their interpersonal relationships and any interpersonal problems. So they already like go to therapy with that, being like, fix me, like what's wrong with me, whatever. But co-narcissists actually, interestingly enough, they benefit most from the relationship with the therapist, which is to say that they benefit from a relationship with a healthy person who doesn't need anything from them. Co-narcissists end up gaining confidence in the accuracy of their own views because of the therapist's agreement with them. They end up kind of like finding themselves in a relationship where the other person is validating them. Sometimes they'll try and like test the therapist to see if like they're gonna explode or if they're gonna have like narcissistic tendencies. But when the therapist like doesn't, they end up like trusting themselves more. They end up trusting the therapist more. So interestingly enough, like the most beneficial part of therapy for co-narcissists is just like that therapy client relationship. So this paper says that for children of narcissists, or for children who have experienced interpersonal problems modeled to them by their parents, there's usually 3 types of responses, okay? The first one is identification. And identification is usually when the child tries to identify with their parents. Their parents wants them to be something, so they try and be that for them. And eventually they end up actually becoming a narcissist themselves, because they try and really convince themselves that they are the parent. Like, it's almost like instead of complying, they try and like get ahead and be like, I'm not obeying my parents because I am them. Like, I embody all of their values and opinions. So we are on the same page. The second response is actually compliance. So it's like when your parents tell you to do something, you listen to them. They tell you to study this program, you listen to them. They tell you to marry this person, you listen to them. They say don't marry this person, you listen to them. Like, you do everything basically that they want. And it becomes like the child is that because they're trying to constantly seek their parents' approval. So this is like, people pleasing. It's sort of what we see more of, where the child becomes like the counterpart that the parent needs from moment to moment. So it's like, if your parent needs you to do this right now for them to feel good about themselves, you do it. And then in like 20 years, they somehow don't care about it anymore, right? So that's the compliance response. And the final response is actually rebellion. So rebellion is like when obviously the child doesn't agree with what the parent wants, and so they fight them and they do everything the opposite of what the parents want. But interestingly enough, because I identified as a rebel like my whole life, but after reading this paper, I realized that rebellion and compliance, they're both different sides of the same coin, which is that you're so influenced by what your parents want, and most of your decisions are made with your parents in mind. The example that this paper gives is that for let's say a student is like academically inclined, but their parents really want them to like get into med school, or their parents really want them to achieve a lot of success academically. If you're a rebel, in order to spite your parents, you might get a 45% on a test just because you want to spite them, even though you were more than capable of getting a 98%. But just to like spite your dad, who like really wants you to get into this program, you end up getting a 45%, and then you end up like not getting into any program. And sure, you did it to spite your parent, but at the end of the day, who are you harming? Your own self. That was like very eye-opening for me. I hear that now from a lot of Muslims. Like, if you grew up in like a really religious, strict household and you weren't allowed to do anything, like you weren't allowed to drink or have like relationships, and then the second your parent is like out of town, then you go and do the most. Like, you just like sleep around with a bunch of people, you just like drink, whatever. Like, you do things that you normally would not have done if you were not rebelling. Like, if you weren't so controlled by your parents' opinions and whatever, and if you had like sort of like the environment to like take your time and discover for yourself what you would want to do, you wouldn't have acted in that extreme way. So this paper goes on to talk about therapy and how it's very beneficial because it helps you to figure out where, like, if you're a narcissist or a co-narcissist, chances are you had a narcissistic parent yourself, and those narcissistic parents had even more narcissistic parents. So it helps to actually identify like at what point in your life made you think about yourself in the way that you do and made you have such low self-esteem. Obviously, that's what therapy does for you, and it helps you heal from that. And the conclusion of this paper actually is it says that narcissism and co-narcissism is on a spectrum. And we all have each of them, narcissism and co-narcissism, to varying degrees. So for example, whenever you start to think about your self-esteem in relation to how other people view you, that is narcissistic vulnerability. And when you feel guilty or anxious because you fear that you're not meeting somebody else's needs or expectations, then you're being co-narcissist. So it's like you can be both. Basically, what's helpful in overcoming your narcissistic tendencies is to realize that other people's behaviors and are a result of their own views and experiences that they're projecting onto you. What other people think about you is not at all what your worth is. And for co-narcissistic tendencies, you have to realize that your strong feelings of guilt and blame, it's not actually real. You're not ever responsible for another person's experience. That's on them. At the end of the day, no matter if you tend to swing more narcissist or you tend to swing more co-narcissist, everybody would benefit to know that they have intrinsic value, okay? Intrinsic worth, intrinsic value, independent of their accomplishments or what other people may think about you. So that's the takeaway point.